Good morning. It's fair to say that 2020 has been a challenging year for most of us. For some people, this year has brought about the unexpected death of a loved one. For others, it has been the loss of a job. For many, there is the anxiety of what the future may hold. Weddings have been cancelled. People have not been able to attend funerals. For most people, it has meant not being able to see and hug their friends and their family. And if we were to look back to this time last year, approaching the end of 2019, moving into 2020, then none of us saw this coming. We had our plans for 2020, our goals, our hopes, our dreams. There were holidays that were booked, and yet so many of these things simply never happened. If you'd been an Israelite living in Jerusalem in 586 BC, then 586 BC was a really challenging year. And even though there were a few faithful voices warning of what was just around the corner, most people just didn't see 586 BC or see the events of 586 BC coming. And to be fair, 586 BC was a lot worse than 2020. If you've looked at our Taking It Further video for episode 6, then you would have already seen and maybe downloaded this chart of the kings and the prophets. And so you'll know that the northern kingdom of Israel was taken into exile by the Assyrians in 722 BC, which we read about in 2 Kings 17. And in terms of our teaching series, that event would have happened about 4 weeks ago. It was before Hezekiah. It was before Josiah. Now we've moved on again another 20 or so years to the end of 2 Kings. Josiah was followed by a series of bad kings, and eventually Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came and laid siege to Jerusalem. Babylon had taken over from Assyria as the world superpower, and so Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed Jerusalem. He killed many of its people. He exiled others, marching them off to Babylon, including people like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, people like Mordecai. But those are whole different stories, maybe a story for a different autumn term. But when events like 2020 happen to us, it's natural to try and make sense of what has happened, to ask, why has this happened? And I think it's true to say that the more that you've lost, then the more you will want to try and make sense of what has happened. The biggest theological questions often revolve around trying to make sense of having a loving God on one hand and yet bad things happening to good people on the other. And for the Jewish exiles who were now in Babylon, the unthinkable had happened. And they were full of questions. If Yahweh was God, then how could this have happened? If Yahweh was the all-powerful creator, then how could he be defeated by the gods of Babylon, gods of wood and stone? If God had made promises to David about a never-ending dynasty, then how could the king be taken prisoner and the palace be destroyed? If the temple was the place where God had chosen to dwell, then how could it be in ruins? If God had promised the land to Abraham, then how could they have been expelled? One of the reasons that the book of Kings was written was to help those exiles to understand what had happened and why. We were thinking earlier on in our service about the Advent theme of hope, and hope was one of the reasons that Kings was written, because Kings addresses each of these questions that we've just asked. Yes, it's true that you are in exile. Yes, the temple has been destroyed. Yes, the city has been burned. Yes, all of that is true. But God is still God. God hasn't been defeated by the gods of the Babylonians. God is still in control. He is working out his plans and his purposes. God is faithful to his word. One of the reasons that Josiah tore his robes in the story that we looked at last week was because the book of the law was rediscovered in the temple, and he actually read Deuteronomy for the first time in his life. And he read the agreement, the contract, the covenant that the people had entered into with God. God would be their God. He was going to bless them abundantly. He'd already brought them up out of Egypt, freeing them from slavery. He had promised that he was going to give them the promised land. But this wasn't an unconditional promise. If you read through the story, as we have done each autumn since 2014, from Genesis through to the end of 2 Kings, then again and again we come across the conditions of the covenant. And when Josiah read these conditions, he tore his robes. There are short warnings, like the one on the screen now, from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 19 and 20, where God warns the people that if they chase after foreign gods, they will be destroyed. And then there are longer sections, like Deuteronomy chapter 8, a whole chapter where God lists the blessings for obedience, but also the curses for disobedience, including the specific warning that they will be driven out of the land. And it's not as if the people were unaware of this agreement. As you read through this story, many times the covenant was read and the people agreed to the terms and conditions. But we've seen, as we've read this story from Genesis through to the end of 2 Kings, that whilst there were certainly some high points, for a lot of this story, the people chose to disobey God and to do their own thing. And up until this point, God has been slow to anger, but time has finally run out and judgment has now come. So how is this a message of hope to those exiles now in Babylon? Well, built in to the covenant was the promise of restoration. God says, after you've been exiled, if you turn your hearts back to me, then I will restore you. And 2 Kings ends with the deposed King Jehoiakim, a descendant of David, released from prison and eating at the king's table in Babylon. And we'll read Jehoiakim's name again in the Old Testament. There's in the parallel stories that we find in Chronicles, there are his encounters with the prophets of his day, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. There's an historical reference in Esther that roots her story in history. But then we'll read his name again at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel. The promise to David back in 2 Samuel chapter 7 had been for a king, a descendant of David who would establish his kingdom forever. And even after hundreds of years, there were still some people who hadn't given up hope. They were still waiting. They were still anticipating the one that God would send, the Messiah, Jesus. And now, at this first Christmas, the Messiah Jesus arrives, a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of David, a descendant of Jehoiakim. And so 2 Kings 25 was never going to be the end of the story. God hadn't been defeated. Now 2020 has been a tough year, and whilst there is hope that with the vaccine life might get back to some kind of normality in 2021, we're going to be living with the impact of 2020 for a long time. There are the financial consequences, there is the mental health fallout, and so 2021 is going to be another challenging year. But Advent is a season of hope and peace and joy and love, not just because we look back, but also because we look forward. Traditionally, Advent is a season of preparation, but not just preparation for Christmas. Because The New Testament talks about Jesus coming, not just at Christmas, but also about this thing called the second coming, looking ahead to a day in the future when Jesus will return not as a baby, but as a king. And the Bible uses the language of judgment to describe that day. And the idea of judgment is not something that we find particularly comfortable. You know, we're happy to look back to the exile because clearly those people got what they deserved after they'd been warned so many times again and again and again. But the idea of a judgment in the future, that's not something that we're so sure about. The Christians in the New Testament were eagerly anticipating that day when every wrong would be put right, when they would be vindicated, when they would receive their reward for their faithfully following Jesus, whatever the cost. But theirs was a context of persecution. Living as a disciple of Jesus in the first century put you on a kind of a collision course with the Roman emperor, and usually that had particularly nasty outcomes. But all too often we've grown comfortable in this world. We view this world as home. We live as though this is all there is. But without the big story that has its beginning in Genesis, that has its ending in Revelation, without that big story, the hope and the love and the joy and the peace of Christmas makes no sense, and it disappears when the lights and the decorations get put back in the loft. But the good news is that there is a big story, and behind it there is a God who is in control. And a day is coming when all the wrongs in this world are going to be put right, when we will no longer live with the consequences of sin and sickness and death, when there will be love instead of hate, when there will be joy instead of sorrow, when there will be peace instead of anxiety, when there will be hope instead of despair, when we won't be separated from the presence and the love of God. And because of Christmas and because of Easter, we can look forward to that day with anticipation and hope rather than with dread and with fear. Because of Jesus, because of his birth, because of his life, because of his death, because of his resurrection, we can know new life. Not just new life in the future, but new life in the present, now. Life with God. Back in 2 Kings, the people were exiled because of their rebellion against God. But there was always this promise: if you turn your hearts back to God, he will bring you back. And we can know forgiveness for the mistakes and for the rebellion that we have been involved in. No matter what we have done, no matter how far from God we have gone, we can turn our hearts back to God, and we will be welcomed into his family as children of God. And even though this life is often a dark experience, in that darkness we can know the hope and the joy and the peace and the love that's only possible because we know that God is with us. And so this Advent season, may it be a time of preparation and anticipation, not just as we look back, but also as we look forward.